Subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. New stories every day. Don't miss out.
The train arrived under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow sound itself. The night pressed against the windows, thick and unmoving, carrying only the faintest whisper of wind that trembled across the rails. At Red Creek Junction, the air smelled of iron and dust, of old wood and the faint tang of oil that lingered in the corners of the empty station. It was a town that didn't greet newcomers. It merely existed, a pause between places where the living and the lost brushed past one another quietly. Ethan Brady stepped onto the platform and felt the absence before he heard it. No laughter, no clatter of boots on the boards, no barking dogs in the distance. Even the occasional whistle of a train seemed muted, as if the world had swallowed its own noise. Only the metallic ringing of some unseen mechanism within the station echoed faintly, constant, almost alive. He walked with the careful slowness of someone who had memorized every step of a route meant to vanish into. His boots scuffed lightly over worn planks, and for a moment he thought he might be the first to arrive in this quiet corner in decades. But the shadows that stretched along the walls told a different story. They were patient. They waited, indifferent to his presence. Ethan carried no badge, no gun, no intent to hide from the law. He carried memory, heavy and sharp, lodged deep inside his chest like a nail. The memory of a night when everything went wrong, when his partner fell not by chance, but because timing had been too precise, because some outside hand had manipulated the path they walked. Others whispered of accidents, misfortune, cruel coincidence. Ethan knew better. He knew the subtle hand of calculation that left his partner dead and himself alive. The town itself seemed to lean toward secrecy. Every storefront was dark, but not lifeless. Some windows reflected only shadows. Some flickered with weak candlelight, as if life existed on a cautious, measured delay. The main street stretched long and empty, lined with buildings that had once been stores, saloons, or offices. Paint peeled like scabs over weathered wood, and the occasional sign swung quietly on rusted hinges. Nothing moved unless it wanted to be noticed, and even the wind seemed to tread carefully here. He found the supply shop almost by accident. A single lantern burned in the window, warm against the chill of the night. Inside, a woman stood behind the counter, still and silent, as though she had been expecting him all along. She did not ask his name, did not inquire about his past or his purpose. Her eyes held him for a heartbeat too long, careful and measured, and in them was a quiet warning. Here, in the heart of this deserted junction, the past was not forgotten, it was carefully concealed. Ethan moved through the quiet with the sense that each step carried him further into a story he was only beginning to read. The town had no mercy for the curious, yet it offered a refuge to those who understood the rules of silence. And as he lingered by the counter, water and tobacco in hand, he realized the truth he had known but avoided. Red Creek Junction was no place to disappear. It was a place where the hidden waited, and where a man who ran from memory might finally confront what had been chasing him all along. Ethan took work at the station quietly, letting his hands grow calloused and his muscles remember the rhythm of labor. He lifted crates, swept platforms, repaired broken lines, and guided the occasional freight car along rusted tracks. The work was honest, physical, grounding, yet in the hum of machinery and the scrape of metal, he found fragments of unease. There was a rhythm to Red Creek Junction, a cadence that carried secrets just below the surface, and the longer he stayed, the more he began to sense it. People spoke in hushed tones, rarely finishing sentences, often glancing toward the edges of the streets before answering even the simplest question. Conversations about the land outside the station were cautious, almost ritualized in their restraint. Old workers spoke of a family who had once owned the hills surrounding the town, who refused to sell their property to the railroad. Months later, they had vanished. No bodies, no footprints leading away, nothing but the echo of absence. The locals shared stories of strange lights flickering at night over the old lot, of whispers and the sound of steps that vanished into darkness. But no one investigated, and no one claimed to know what had truly happened. Ethan noticed anomalies that didn't belong, footprints leading nowhere near the abandoned warehouses, shadows that seemed to linger longer than any passerby could cast. Once, a figure stood near a fenced-off section of the old property, motionless, observing, only to dissolve into the night as Ethan approached. There was a pattern here, a deliberate orchestration behind the quiet disappearance of people and the weight of unspoken fear. The sheriff's office, with its peeling paint and low-hanging sign, offered no solace. When Ethan mentioned his observations, the sheriff smiled too easily, an edge of amusement masking something else, a flicker of concern or perhaps calculation. He dismissed the stories of light and sound as imagination, yet Ethan sensed tension beneath the calm exterior, a subtle warning that some truths were not meant for casual curiosity. At night, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and charred wood from somewhere distant. Ethan walked along the edges of the town, inspecting the old lots, noting the abandoned tracks that split into the hills. He felt the pull of history in the soil, a weight of lives erased by unseen hands, and a thread connecting each vanishing. It was as though the land itself remembered the injustice, holding its memory like a warning for anyone patient enough to watch. Each day, the pattern deepened. He became aware of how the town seemed to breathe around him, how workers and residents moved in synchrony, but always with a gap, a hesitation, as if expecting something or someone. And Ethan understood that he, too, had become part of that rhythm, a quiet observer threading through a town that knew more than it revealed. His past had led him here, and now he began to see that the secrets of Red Creek Junction were not scattered. They were concentrated, deliberate, waiting for someone who refused to look away. Ethan's hands were calloused, his body tired, but his mind moved faster than ever. He understood that running had brought him here, but staying and watching was what would allow him to follow the traces, to see where absence led, to confront the pattern hidden beneath the quiet, to understand the land where people vanished without a trace. Klara moved quietly through the supply shop, a figure both still and watchful, as if she existed in two worlds at once, the one around her and the one her family had lost. She had always known the story of the land, how it had been taken piece by piece, how names vanished from ledgers, replaced by falsified signatures and official documents that no one dared to question. Her father had spoken in hushed tones about the family who refused to sell, about the night when authority had come knocking and the world had shifted irreversibly. Ethan, unaware of the full extent of her knowledge, lingered near the counter, tracing the edge of old maps and brittle documents with his eyes. He did not seek gold, nor fame, nor revenge for its own sake. He sought understanding. That distinction, subtle as it was, marked him as dangerous to those who preferred the past buried. Klara recognized it immediately. She had seen the same determination in countless faces before, faces that had vanished or returned broken. The shop itself seemed a pocket outside time, Dust motes floated in lantern light, settling on stacks of ledgers, maps, and yellowed letters. There was a smell of ink and old paper, faintly metallic, like a memory preserved in scent. Klara had never opened the papers, never traced the lines on the maps, but she had always held them, keeping the fragments of truth intact, waiting for someone who could navigate the web of deception without being ensnared. As Ethan examined the documents, a subtle tension filled the room. Each page hinted at the scale of manipulation. Who had signed? Who had vanished? Who had profited? Klara observed him, measuring his intent, his patience, his willingness to follow the thread into the parts of the world the town itself ignored. There was no fear in her gaze, only caution sharpened by experience. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, carrying faint echoes of the station, the tracks, the quiet movements of the town. Red Creek Junction had a rhythm, a pulse, and both Ethan and Klara felt it. They were outsiders and insiders simultaneously, drawn by the same curiosity, the same need to see beyond the surface. The land remembered its owners, and the air seemed to hum with the memory of their absence. For the first time, Ethan understood that this place did not merely hide the past, it preserved it. Every shadow, every silence, every cautious glance told a story, waiting for the right observer. Klara had chosen to remain a guardian of these fragments, and Ethan's arrival had awakened the possibility that the pieces might finally fit together. In that quiet, in that shop lit by a single lantern, the first connection was made, and the subtle danger of uncovering truth began to stir, promising both clarity and conflict in equal measure. The night air was thick with smoke before anyone realized what had happened. The old warehouse, long abandoned and crumbling, had erupted in flames, sudden and violent. Sparks clawed at the sky, painting it with red-orange streaks that flickered against the dark hills. The heat pressed against Ethan's face as he approached, heart hammering, not from the fire, but from recognition. Someone had sent a message, a warning, precise and cruel. Inside the warehouse, documents that had survived decades of dust and neglect were now at the mercy of the flames. Ledgers, maps, and faded papers twisted under the heat, curling into ash as if hiding secrets one last time. Klara moved with calm determination, scooping what she could into a satchel, her hand steady despite the chaos. The smell of smoke and ink burned at their nostrils, and each rescued page felt like carrying a fragment of buried history back into the world. Among the papers, the truth revealed itself in small, deliberate details. Signatures that had been forged, sales recorded that never happened, names of families erased from existence. The scale of deception stretched farther than Ethan had imagined, a network of manipulation reaching through lawmen, businessmen, and the quiet men who ran Red Creek Junction from the shadows. And at the center of it all was Houston Reed, a man whose reach extended like roots into every corner of the town, whose presence was felt even in his absence. Ethan's pulse quickened with a mix of fear and determination. Every lost partner, every vanished neighbor, every quiet lie that had gone unchallenged, it was all connected. The fire had burned with intent, a statement as much as a threat, but it had also revealed cracks, openings where the hidden might finally be exposed. Klara's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. The real fight had begun. The flames reflected in the windows of nearby buildings, flickering across shuttered homes and darkened streets. Red Creek Junction had always been patient, always calculated, but for the first time, the town seemed to lean forward, anticipating the unmasking of truths it had long held. And Ethan understood that the pursuit of those truths carried a cost, a dangerous, inevitable collision with those who had thrived in silence for too long. The following days reshaped Red Creek Junction. Workers who had once kept their heads down began to ask questions, their voices low at first, then gradually louder. The station, the veins of commerce that fed the town, suffered deliberate disruption. Tracks were sabotaged, trains delayed, shipments delayed, money withheld. Calm order that Houston Reed had maintained through quiet fear began to fracture, revealing both cracks in the system and the lengths he would go to maintain control. Ethan moved carefully through the chaos, recognizing patterns and predicting responses. He understood that the death of his partner had been part of this very network, the same invisible hand that now attempted to bend the town to Reed's will. Each act of sabotage, each whispered threat through the sheriff was a message, but the people were no longer silent, and the undercurrent of fear began to swell into defiance. Shadows that had once lurked unseen now had to act, to respond, to protect what they had manipulated. Ethan traced the connections with precision, watching the movements of men who had once seemed untouchable. He realized that fleeing had brought him here, but confronting the system required presence, courage, and patience. Every discovery, every document, every step toward exposing the lies tightened the noose around Reed's influence. The town itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, the hum of tension vibrating through wooden floors, over rails, and into the night air. Men and women who had quietly suffered injustice began to see themselves as part of a larger movement, a collective that could no longer be ignored. And Ethan, once a man haunted by memory, became a fulcrum, a point around which hidden truths began to turn toward revelation. Every shadow held a warning, every empty street a question, and every fire, real or metaphorical, became an invitation to act. Red Creek Junction was waking, and the cost of truth was about to be paid in full. The documents were finally laid bare, and with them, the power that Houston Reed had held for years crumbled like dry timber. The sheriff, once a figure of quiet intimidation, stepped down under the weight of exposure, leaving the town to confront its own history. For the first time, residents could see the foundation on which their lives had been manipulated, built not on justice, but on lies. Klara no longer remained silent. She walked the streets with quiet authority, sharing fragments of knowledge and history with those who had been kept in the dark. Ethan, who had come running from memory and guilt, no longer fled. He stayed, not because of love or comfort, but because he had found purpose in truth. Together, they rebuilt not just understanding, but the fragile sense of justice that had been buried by years of fear. The town, once muted and cautious, breathed again. Streets carried life, conversations no longer faltered mid-sentence, and the rhythm of Red Creek Junction returned with clarity. The past was not erased, but it no longer held dominion over those who dared to confront it. And in that revelation, there was a quiet triumph, the kind that leaves scars and lessons, but also a sense of completion. Ethan understood that some truths were worth staying for, that sometimes running toward memory led not to escape, but to reckoning. And as he and Klara walked past the station, past the streets where shadows had once whispered, The town itself seemed to sigh, acknowledging the persistence of courage over fear. For those who follow stories of dust, faith, and second chances, Red Creek Junction's story was only the beginning. To hear more tales of people who choose to confront hidden truths and start anew, subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales, where every shadow has a story and every silence holds a secret waiting to be uncovered.